So welcome everyone. This is our webinar between Kaplan Consulting, my dear friend MJ, who can introduce herself in a moment, and Loomio. I'm the Customer Success Manager at Loomio. My name's John Gieryn, calling in from Wellington, New Zealand, and we're really happy to be here today with you all, talking about how do we do governance really well in these times? What are the practices that we need for adapting to this new reality? And so just give folks one more chance to participate in this first prompt here. Just again, inviting introductions and a brief response to this question. I'm really curious what might be holding your organization back in this time, maybe especially in terms of governance or more generally. And I'll just read out a few as a couple people more add them. Got comments like, overall organizational bandwidth holding back, consumed by the day-to-day, quick consensus decision-making, the need to hold a virtual GMM soon, or AGM, strategic planning for nonprofits, online learning and facilitating meetings in this time. And there's a lot going on. And a lot of shared threads as well. So with that, pass it to MJ to introduce herself a little bit more and bring us in a little bit.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. And we just want to start with a big breath because this has just been such a hard time, we know, for people all over the world. And we really have to start with taking care of ourselves, whether it's, we're board members or staff. Many of us are board or both. Certainly in our roles as family or household members. If we don't take care of ourselves, we're not going to be able to support the organizations and the communities we care so deeply about. So we hope you're well and the people that are in your circles, your loved ones are well also. And we just wanted to start by introducing ourselves. I am MJ Kaplan, and I'm based in Providence, Rhode Island. I have been working as a coach and consultant to transform people and organizations to be the best they can be for over 30 years. And I think of myself as a local global consultant. I'm deeply involved in my local community here in the States, but I also work globally, and I've been working remotely for many years. So although this context is so new for many, it's quite familiar for me. And I think about my work as combining sort of human-centered, caring about how people work together with tech-enabled support. So I stepped into Loomio a number of years ago when I did some work in New Zealand and spent a couple of years on the working on the team and more recently on the board. And Loomio is just really aligned with my focus on decentralized, agile, adaptive organizations. So I'm currently on the board of Loomio. I sit on a statewide board for economic development and also on a social enterprise community-based board. And I'm just delighted to partner with my buddy John, who, as he said, is from Loomio.
Yeah, awesome. And basically at Loomio, I'm the person walking along with groups to help them achieve their purpose. Loomio is an online tool that supports people to start and hold conversations that move to clear outcomes. And I'll share a little bit more about the app if anybody's unfamiliar with it later in the presentation. But let's take a quick look at our agenda. MJ, do you want to take us through it?
Oh, sure. We're really going to do a little bit of big picture just because adaptive governance, I believe, actually should always be taking place, but it's an imperative in our current context with the pandemic. So we're just going to check in about that big picture a little bit, and then we're going to drill down quite specifically to talk about some of the different tools, both real-time like Zoom that we're on, but also a lot of asynchronous tools to try to be much more adaptive given the urgency and complexity of the issues we're dealing with. And then we'll leave plenty of time. We're going to spend about 35 minutes in the webinar, sharing content, and then we'll open up for questions and be delighted to engage with you on your specific issues.
Yeah, and don't hesitate to use the chat throughout the presentation one more time. Very much welcome any questions, and we'll just take them in stride and fit them in as we can, or save them to the end of the question and answer. We do invite folks to keep their mics muted for the most part, just so everybody can hear. But we will encourage, especially in that question and answer, people to unmute themselves and share when the time comes. And we'll be sharing this recording with folks afterwards, as well as the slide deck. So
And I know we're a community of practice, really. We're all learning together. So in addition to questions, if you have ideas of any solutions or tips or apps that are working for you, feel free to share in the chat as well.
Great. Let's get into it.
Yeah, all right. So big picture, needless to say, we all understand that this pandemic is hitting us at a global level, and we're understanding how interconnected we all really are, and at a local level. And it really doesn't matter what sector you're in. The impact has been agnostic, unfortunately. And I think we need to understand that, really the first stage is shock. And many of us are just adjusting to that in our organizations. If you're a nonprofit, many nonprofits are realizing that, many things that they count on in terms of funding are just, super up in the air, and that the possibility of the longevity of this could be a year or 2 years. It's unprecedented in scale. And really, I've had executives from all sectors that I've been working with in my coaching that say they've just never been in such an uncertain world context, and that they have never felt less clear about what the right thing to do is. So I think even grief has been a sort of rampant emotion at the early stage. I really think of these kinds of crises as in 3 stages. I've been through plenty, from September 11th here in the US, and the economic recession, but also many weather events and others in various countries. And first is triage, just totally reactive. And I think we're just moving out of that in many places. The second is sort of a reality check. What's really the impact and the consequence that we're dealing with? And this can often be a time when some organizations are really wondering if they're going to be able to survive. And eventually, organizations will get to starting to see openings and opportunities, pivots, and new possibilities. And I really encourage trying to create space for that sooner rather than later, because as you try to think about the stepping stones to the future, making short-term choices based on a longer-term sense of possibility is really productive.
Yeah. Yeah, now more than ever, good governance is really critical. And there's a number of principles we could look to in good governance. And what I really want to call your attention to, we could go into any and all of these, and I'm happy to share this deck with you afterwards. But at the end, what kind of ties all of them together is often clear communication, as well as nimble. And especially today, we're looking at these remote processes. How do we connect when we're not in the same room, when we can't be together at the same time? But clear communication is really the underpinning piece of doing any work with other people.
So I know there's a lot here, and I'm just going to walk through it, but I think we have to start with what do we mean by adaptive governance? And I would say in this context, you have to do frequent sense making. And what I mean by sense making is checking in about how things are changing, whether it's the legislation and the guidelines around being remote in your communities, or funding opportunities, how the virus is impacting, many aspects of your operation. So this is something that in a more stable environment, we may do on a quarterly basis, but now it's been everything from a daily basis to a weekly basis. And I think this is a time where bringing in diverse perspectives and also reliable data, and that combination of the human side of sense making with reliable data is really clear, really critical. I think the next piece is risk assessment. As I said, for some organizations, it's literally wondering about survival. So what people are talking about is, being able to stay in business for a period of time to be able to get on solid footing to think about the longer haul. And so thinking about, what are the steps you need to mitigate risk. I was in a session recently where people talked about boards and leaders' accountability to have moral authority. And that's really doing the right thing. It's thinking about, are you really taking care of your people? This question of, are people getting protective gear? Are you giving people the proper time off and the support if they're sick? So I think we need really to step in as boards and leaders to make sure we're doing the right thing. It's a time to reaffirm your core purpose and principles, but not necessarily programs and services. So what is the heart and soul of what you believe in and what you're about? But maybe you're going to need to let go of programs that aren't as relevant in this context. I saw Julie DeBerry on, and we just did a session with nonprofits about really focusing on the people you serve and what will provide value, making sure if we're the staff or boards of organizations, we're not getting so caught up in our own issues, our own bias, that we're not involving the voice and the perspective of the people we serve. Working fast and slow, by that contradiction, I mean, we need to work fast. Many organizations, the faster you're able to make decisions and move, the more likely you're going to be in good stead. That's certainly been the case in terms of funding. But working slow at the same time means that you're pausing to make sure that you're not overly emotional, reactive, that you aren't reinforcing bias and other kinds of things. So you need to be able to sort of integrate those contradictions so that you're doing the best decision-making possible. Reassess frequently, similar to working fast and slow. Hold your assumptions lightly because things are changing that we need to constantly be open to learning and interpreting the new data. And finally, crisis is always an opportunity to innovate. That's when most innovation happens. And many of the things that you might consider as possibilities, you want to try as experiments. So for boards that tend to be more risk averse, this is a time maybe to rethink that and to consider giving your staff some room to really innovate. John, we lost the presentation.
1 second. Sorry about that.
Well, I'll just jump in. I was going to tell a little story about being on a board that I sit in, which is the Social Enterprise Greenhouse. So we're an intermediary that supports the social enterprise community here in Rhode Island and Southern New England. And I just feel so proud of the way we've handled the crisis. So we, of course, the staff and the board immediately went remote. Now, the good news is our board was already used to using Loomio and other remote tools. So, and we have a very high culture, high trust culture. So, we were in good stead to be able to run fast in terms of the crisis. But we moved from monthly meetings to weekly meetings. We've been doing rapid sense making. It's a time for boards to think about more support to the team and really giving the team, the leadership team, the staff team, a fair amount of support, and not to be a barrier. I think not to say that you're not being accountable, but not to be a barrier. And we've been using video for our exec comm meetings. We've also had some decisions that really required very fast turnaround time. We've been using Loomio for that. And one example is that we put in for the federal funding really quickly for the US, and we got that funding. So we already got that. We were in the first round. We're about to sign the paperwork. So huge in terms of our ability then to do some deep breathing and be able to know we have a few months where we can pay staff and get our feet on the ground. We've been doing some work around validating our principles, and we've got a big, strong focus on equity. And we know there's huge equity gaps right now in terms of the impact on people of color and low-income people. So we are adjusting some of our programs. We've shifted some programs, we've eliminated some programs, and we've added some programs. We're doing some old-fashioned one-on-one outreach. We're finding the phone is this unbelievable tool that we'd all sort of forgotten about. And so we're just finding those one-on-ones super valuable feedback and input. We did a board meeting on Zoom, and we found it very smooth because this other work was happening to support the board being ready to go to continue to move forward. And we're doing a lot of evaluation, very fast, evaluate, iterate, and we're using all the tools, shared documents, Loomio, video meetings, all the tools at our disposal to be able to work quickly and sort of across the time and geography.
Yeah, that's been our experience at the Loomio Co-operative as well. Coming into the lockdown, the quarantine that we have here in New Zealand, you know, one thing that came to our mind was like, go slow to go smooth to go fast. And so we took our time, made a decision about how we were going to work from home, what kind of meetings we needed to do that, having a regular check-in every day. And then we've iterated that a couple times, but never at any point had to like really rush to do it, but just steadily, as we give ourselves an hour every week to have a little bit of perspective, how did the last week go, kept adapting that to really serve our needs during this period and recognize that those needs are changing as we go. I wanted to share just a little bit about some of the key tools that we think everybody should be thinking about in these remote times for governance and for their teams as a whole. And those largely fall into these 4 categories. We've got real time, like what we're using right now. We have what I call asynchronous, or talking about threads, decision tools. Your email would fall into this category as well. The ability to share big files and task management. I'll run briefly through them. You know, we've got Zoom, we've also got our instant chats. These are the things that give us immediate response. And then when I say asynchronous, you can think about your email, you could think about the corkboard in the coffee shop. These are things that people are reading and posting on their own time. So we highly recommend that you have an option for this, and we'll go into a little bit more of the benefits there. Sharing big files, there's a number of different platforms, Google Drive, you know, there's open source alternatives like OwnCloud, ways to transfer big files like WeTransfer. And finally, task management. And both the big files and the task management, it's good to have again, asynchronous platform, a place where you're having long form discussions where you can post links about who is doing what and things. So even for sharing big files, we kind of direct people, help people navigate our cloud storage by linking from topic threads. So we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So I named this slide real time versus on your own time, but really these things all work in conjunction. So blending real time with asynchronous helps you create better, faster, and adaptive governance. I'll toss it to MJ if you want to talk a little bit about some of the differences here, or some of the pros and cons.
Well, in terms of the video conferencing, of course, the interactivity, facial expressions, we know that people are learning about how to connect more humanly on video. We also know that there's huge video fatigue going on. So it is a challenge. I know some of my clients are moving towards a maximum of 1 or 2 video meetings a day. And I think, you know, it was understandable that in the rush to try to coordinate, people were on Zoom a lot, or whatever tool you use for real time. But I think it's better for people to start pulling back and complement the real time with more asynchronous. It's, you know, especially given that people are juggling. I think, you know, the reality is that we're not going back in terms of understanding how the opportunity of video connecting, but we understand that there's pros and cons, limitations, and we're going to need to balance it both in this time where we're forced to be dispersed, but also after, in terms of thinking, how can we leverage it, but also understand its limitations?
Yeah, we heard a story at Loomio where people, out of a desire to be seen to be engaged with their company, were just scheduling tons of video calls. And I think it's really missing an opportunity around there's other ways to show that we're present, to show that we're checked in. There's a number of different tools that, without taking up huge amounts of your day at specific times, you can still show up and be seen to be present.
One thing I'll say is that, you know, I have been part of an organization that's been remote for a couple of years, and we've found that we have done a lot of things that people think that they can't do. I mean, we've done celebrations, we've welcomed people, we've done farewells for people, we've danced together. And I think people are even finding, because we are in this unusual situation, you know, there's the, you know, remote drinks and all the social things we're doing with our friends, and we can bring those in to work as well. I have a colleague who does improv, and she's doing improv on video. So there's lots that's possible if it's done thoughtfully and done well.
Yeah, definitely. Having those informal interactions as well. Great point, Jim. So just a couple quick things. I really just want to leave you this slide when we send you the slide deck, but there's some things that you want to think about with video conferencing. Largely, especially when coming to governance, has to do with preparation, having a backup in mind. Seeing people's faces can be really helpful. Hand signals, of course, can quicken things dramatically in certain cases, getting everybody on the same page about what those are. And then using rounds where everybody has a chance to share can just help things run a bit more smoothly. There's also sometimes when just asynchronous is a great option. I just have this little example of an investing cooperative, and for choosing how to allocate a certain budget, they actually find just doing an asynchronous tool is actually more effective than being in person for that kind of decision. And there's a couple other benefits: alleviating time pressure, giving people time to sleep on it. But when you bring these things together, a lot of the times you can just be better prepared, take care of some of the stuff that's, if you're raising your hands in your meetings, these are all opportunities to have that done ahead of time so that you can use the precious in-person time for the deeper conversations. You can get the record of the decisions, so even during a meeting, using other tools can help you so that you know what you decided back then, or why did we decide that? And then having a place to put follow-up actions so that things aren't on a bunch of different email threads or a bunch of different platforms. I'm going to share just one example of, on our platform Loomio, how we're using asynchronous to really aid our governance processes. Just wanted to briefly say, if you didn't know, Loomio is a discussion forum with tools to facilitate engagement and decision-making. It's a communications platform that's especially for these asynchronous communications. So you have threads and you use proposals or polls to get group input, make it visible where the group stands on something, and finally record outcomes. And so I just am going to breeze you through these because I'm really going to leave you with the resources to go check this out on your own. But some of the things we see boards doing now is identifying conversations in advance, getting people to review the papers, giving the facilitator context, who's read the thing or how much detail do I need to preface this conversation with. Getting decisions done between meetings. Some decisions are actually better to just take in advance. Doing the election, we have rank voting on Loomio. We've seen groups get even complicated decisions like which liability insurance are we going to do. We don't need to do that during our meeting necessarily. We have this nice outcome that's a nice record for down the line. Of course, the time poll, you may have used Doodle. And then taking conversations that maybe you didn't finish and you can continue them online. So restarting this thread, we started talking about this, let's move it forward. And so the idea is you can have a lot of times all of this in one thread. And in general, you can have it all in one place and easily searchable, a nice archive. And so with that, yeah, we're to the question and answer period. So we'd love to hear from you. Actually going to stop the share so we can see folks who are raising their hands and just make it easy for folks.
We're going to be informal. So if you have a question, yell out.
And we'll try and call on people. I do have people across a couple screens though.
Kia ora, hi there. Hey, I'm speaking from Kapiti, just north of Wellington, and I was curious about. I work for Kapiti Coast District Council, and I was curious about whether any local governments across Aotearoa have used Loomio for decision making around budgets or planning, long-term planning.
Yes. I mean, one of the first use cases for Loomio was Wellington City Council. They, although, you know, they didn't use it, I don't think at that time for budgeting, but a number of ministries have used it. Some for, you know, budget related, others not, some local governments. John, you probably know more recent ones.
Yeah, I'm forgetting the name right now, but just one of the most exciting recent groups that we had the privilege to be working with was a group that was having young Pacifica people to make decisions about where the grants were going. So we're running this program, people were applying for grants and they were teaching them about governance and how to manage a budget by doing voting online and conversation and how are they meeting our criterias.
There may be a blog about that even, if I recall, I'm not sure, on the website.
Cool, thanks very much. I had set up Loomio to facilitate a conversation between two of my good friends during last year, but I work in the planning space at the council, so I hadn't quite moved my head to the application of it in that sphere, so that's really helpful to know that Wellington had done that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one question about the number of people using the tool. What is your experience? In other words, is there a number above which it doesn't work because there are too many people trying to participate or trying to have this discussion through Loomio? You know, can you say something about the number of people where it works, and above a certain number maybe it doesn't work?
Yeah. John, you
Absolutely.
want to take
that? Yeah. So right now we have a group that's going through a decision-making process with 500 folks in the Ukraine around a housing development that people are stakeholders of. And so we can host, I mean, we had the NZEI, the teachers union, do a consultation of their union members to decide on their demands with over 2,000 people. But it definitely, the kind of conversation you're having definitely changes from that compared to a board of 10 to 15 people or a group of 20. You know, some of the numbers that come out of social research around like Dunbar's number getting up to 100 to 150 in terms of having really deep conversations certainly hold true. And so it kind of with any sort of tool or with any conversation, you know, any even thing that you're doing in person, you're going to think about, you know, how deeply can we have this conversation with a number of people in the room, and how am I going to ask for input? How is that input going to be processed? So when we go to the bigger groups, you know, there may be more times when we're asking for input, having a smaller group synthesize that input, and then bringing it back to that group for ratification or something like this.
I'll just add to that and totally agree with John. We designed Loomio really from the get-go, understanding that small groups, Google talks about the size that eat a pizza. So we've known for decades and decades that 8 to 12 is the sweet spot of, you know, the size of a group that can do the best collective decision-making. But the design is also set up with subgroups, so you can have lots of different kinds of conversations. I'm setting up a group now across Colombia, the country, for a project with the United Nations. So we will have probably over 1,200 people that participate in this, but we'll have small group circles that will be having dialogues. And I did another project with the UN that was global, that we did something similar. So many of the Loomio groups or smaller groups have exploring a similar topic, and then, you know, sort of combining those outputs to a meta output. So you know, it's sort of best use is a small group with decision authority, but there's lots of design architecture that can play with bigger groups.
Thank you very much.
A couple questions in the chat. What about making Zoom more dynamic with other tools? Heard about tools where people can put up sticky notes, for example. I'll just drop a couple in the chat here. You know, there's definitely tools like Mural or Miro that are collaborative and visual. I think somebody mentioned Canva, which is a great, easy way to make nice graphics to aid conversations. Not sure if they have a collaborative component.
Right. I think the interoperative functionality with Loomio is getting better all the time. So we don't necessarily have the linkages direct with those tools right now, but we're always working on that. And so right now I know in the Columbia project, for instance, we're integrating video with the writing because it's a very verbal culture and we have a lot of rural communities participating where it's going to be easier to actually upload video content into the chat than it is to be writing the chat real time or doing video.
Hmm.
You know,
and many people don't know that Zoom actually has a whiteboard that you can use. I'm tempted to bring it up right now, but I probably won't take you through that how to just now.
MJ, your comment about cultures leads me to ask whether you have any particular thoughts on best practice for cross-cultural groups, because we have a community, currently we're fairly small, the group within our very large community that actually uses Loomio, but we have about 20 countries and nearly 30 members. And what has been clear to me over the past 3 years of using Loomio is that it's much easier for certain cultures than for other cultures, particularly given that we all communicate in English. So some people are coming from behind if it's not their mother language.
Sure, it's a great question. I think that, you know, Loomio operates in a lot of ways like you would if you were coming together in a room. That's our hope, is that it's really creating a space that you would come together, listen actively, be inclusive, and work together towards agreement and shared understanding. But it's not magic. And one of the things is that we knew that there were so many different types of users and we wanted it to be global that we didn't specify in the app itself guidelines for how to define, for instance, decision-making, because we want the groups, the separate groups, to be able to do that in a way that's culturally appropriate for you. So in terms of how to make that work for you, I would say, even if you've already been using it for a year or two, it might be worth a reboot. You could use the pandemic as an example to go back and say, are we really clear about the principles for the dialogue process and for the decision process? And make sure that you have those explicitly stated and that you return to those frequently. So that would be one example. We have translated Loomio into lots of languages, and mostly the users have done that through translation tool. So the bias in terms of the English speaking, it's, again, that's sort of something you would try to think about if you were gathering in person, the same way you would online, in terms of sensitivities. You know, if you're speaking always in English, then those people are going to dominate. We have found that Loomio has a tendency in being on a platform in general for introverts and people that are not central to the power system to be more active. They feel more comfortable because they don't have to, you know, be jumping into the in-person space, and can be more thoughtful and take more time. So from that standpoint, we find that it actually is a tool that can be very powerful in terms of being more inclusive. I will say, not specific to multicultural, but I find that if you have a strong culture already, you know, then Loomio is going to be, you know, like a springboard, just accelerating your power and your impact and your speed. If you have a dysfunctional culture, it's not going to solve all of that magically. So I've just seen with the forced moving remote that some organizations have made that shift very elegantly and others, you know, terribly ineffectively. And that often depends on what their culture is. And especially, you know, if there's space for different voices and people to really respect each other, then that's really obvious really quickly when you move into the online environment.
Yeah, going back to that example of the group where people were scheduling all these Zoom calls because they just wanted to be seen to be active, especially with the question of layoffs on the table. Yeah, there's not a tool that can fix that. You know, the governance is ultimately coming from, yeah, what are the behaviors that people with perceived leadership are leading out with, and, you know, what is the culture in terms of trusting one another, in terms of autonomy, moving forward opportunities. I mention it too because we're really excited to have just published a case study of the Ian Martin Group, which is a self-organizing HR company based out of Canada and operating in 3 countries, and adapting quite well in these times. So I will share in the email going out to you all just a little bit of a insight into how they're using kind of what they call self-organizing, or practices around accountability and transparency and engagement and participation, to really, be able to be adaptive in this time and be able to have people working from different places suddenly and still keep good communication going.
I'll give a quick answer to Rachel about could Loomio work for coalition work? It was designed for coalition work. So it was really designed in the community space originally for people that were working collectively, but not necessarily in formal organizations. So absolutely. So the way it works, I mean, if the group decides they want to try Loomio as a platform, then whoever has that administrative accountability for the group would set up the group, and everybody's not, you know, everybody would have an account the way, you know, you might with Skype or Zoom or whatever, but there's one subscription for that group. So there's an administrator, or it can be multiple administrators. So people aren't paying individually.
Great. I can answer Peter really quickly and then jump to Jose, your question there. Does Zoom integrate with scheduling meetings for Loomio? It doesn't, there's not a direct technical automation there. However, I will just show briefly this sort of example of us putting together an AGM. I thought this would be interesting to a number of people in the room anyways. So when we started a subgroup in this case for upcoming AGM. And so we're including that Zoom link prevalently, and kind of with every message that we're putting out to the membership, we're going to include that Zoom link again. So just kind of keeping all the references in one place. So for example, here we have this thread that we've pinned to the top that's get prepared all you need to know, where we have the quite detailed version of all the details for that. So just a little example of how we integrate Zoom into some things. You know, we also use calendar invites. And the other question from Jose was about how do you suggest going about decisions which precede the tool selection, useful criteria, functionality, help an organization choose those tools. Yeah, it's a great point that, yeah, there's definitely the possibility of going too far and trying to adopt too many tools at once. I think looking at those 4 categories I shared with you all, having a solution for real time, having a solution for asynchronous or more thoughtful conversation, something that's better than email. You know, we had a gentleman who runs a governance consulting firm here, Westlake Governance. Richard Westlake goes, you can't do governance by email. So having a solution for that, and then having what's your platform for sharing files, and maybe either something for task management and or something for visual collaboration. Those, if you can fill those categories with as few tools as possible, I think you're doing well. And some criteria, I think, you know, usability, how it's really going to be contextual to your group. So thinking about, you know, what does your group need to be able to use this tool effective? How is this going to complement existing processes? You know, one thing that we found with groups that seem to successfully adopt Loomio is there are groups that tend to have some processes that they can put onto Loomio more immediately, some routines, whether it's approving meeting minutes or, it can be quite simple things, or this kind of decision that we have to make once a year, whatever it is. So just thinking about those processes, thinking about how do your participants already interact with your tools, from where, how, etc. What notifications are going to be useful for them. That's going to help you determine those criteria.
So I'm going to jump to Zeb's question. So it's just yes. Absolutely. We have enterprise clients, and we love that. And we'll work with you. I mean, that's what we're about. We want to create large groups of people that want to have decentralized, nimble collaboration to make the world better. That's why we exist. So we'll work with you, and some of our clients are more resourced than others. Our goal is to make it affordable and actionable. I'm wondering if I could just say a word, John, about the difference. Several people in the NICE survey check-in that John sent out talked about consensus, and that consensus is slow and clunky and even more difficult in this remote context. And I just want to say that again, we designed Loomio so that the type of decision-making protocol that works for your organization is possible. So it could be majority rules, it could be consensus, but increasingly in my work with decentralized organizations and self-management, we're working with consent, which is that somebody puts up a proposal that is safe to try, and it's up to the group to support that. Or if they have a concern, to make it better, but only to go against that if it's a block, that it's not a safe to try proposal. And it's a way to move decision-making much faster. It's super important in this, really difficult time. So Loomio works really well for consent decision-making. And, again, we've given you our emails if that's something that people are interested in. I think that is something for people to consider as a new practice that you may find is a complement to trying to do consensus, but finding that consensus is too slow for the current context.
Totally. And we do have some guides on how the principles of consent-based decision-making, because at the end of the day, these things apply to not just that particular process or protocol of making decisions. Using the idea of, is this safe enough to try, is a really big one. And it can apply to whether you're doing majority vote rules or whatever kind of way of deciding whether or not a proposal has passed. Just this idea of, we do have to keep moving forward. So is it safe enough to try? If yes, let's try it, and then let's iterate and adapt and try something else again if we need to. Coming on our time, and we may be able to stay on just a little bit longer, but we do want to just, if anybody's hopping off, make sure we share a couple last details with you all, just about us. We really thank you all for coming along and all the questions. I just wanted to make you aware that we do have a discount available for folks who came along today or who are viewing this webinar in the next 3 months. So we've got a 25% discount for you. You can have a free trial at loomio.org. And as MJ mentioned, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, I just wanted to reach out and say if I can be helpful. My work is coaching organizations to do this kind of transformation in good times and in bad. I'm a big believer in adaptive, nimble organization, regardless of what the context is. And I do think that crisis is an opportunity to open up new possibilities in how you work, and even as well as what you do. So don't hesitate to reach out if I can support you in any way.
Thank you all.
Content, and yeah, we are totally open to staying a little bit longer if people still have questions. So feel free to hang out a little bit, and we just wanted to also invite those who feel like they need to dash. We understand. We're all a little tired of being on Zoom.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Kia ora,
Thank
thanks
you so
from the
much.
Nice to see you.
Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
I had a question about like time bounding decision making, and I know you said that it really depends on the organization, and I really appreciate you bringing up this idea of consent versus consensus, especially right now. So I'm definitely interested in receiving a link about consent guidelines or having you direct me to where I can see that. I actually have a meeting in like 10 minutes, and it would be really awesome to be able to share that. And then just in terms of time bounding, like our organization, we have voting members and then we have non-voting members. And we've been working on Loomio for a few years now. We haven't been leaning on it super hard, but we've started developing it into like a monthly process where we propose something, we have it up for like 2 weeks, we go into a members meeting. People have an opportunity to discuss it because we were finding that some people were really comfortable writing and then other people would not say anything unless it was an in-person meeting, and then leaving it up for a few days after and then closing it and voting. So that's kind of where we are with that, but I'm just curious, like other ways that people are managing that would be really helpful to just hear about it.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of the time delineation, you have that option. You probably know that in Loomio, that you can set a particular time. And then, you know, having a check-in in terms of, you know, if people aren't being responsive, you know, trying to figure that out. I set a guideline for all my groups to ask people for 100% participation for a proposal. And one of the things that I've learned about Loomio is to abstain is one of the most powerful things, because we often think people aren't engaged, but it's actually that they're willing to let the group make a decision for whatever reason. Maybe they don't feel that strongly about it. Maybe they don't feel it's that relevant, but we don't know if we don't have them express that. So I've discovered abstain as like the best friend. I also think, you know, early on checking in to see if you get a signal pretty quickly in the graph, you know, there's two ways to interpret it. One is like we're getting momentum towards agreement, and the other is to just make sure that you're not having groupthink or, you know, people with less voice or less confidence aren't speaking out. But there is the ability with Loomio in the proposal to comment. You know, that's why we said that. It's not about the what of the decision, but the why of the decision. And we have groups that make a proposal and then somebody says something that suggests that it really should be a block. It's that strong. And then it goes back to discussion because that wasn't the best. Or perhaps there's just a nuance, it's an improvement. And so the person who made the proposal says, you know, fantastic, I totally agree with that. That improves the proposal. So we'll incorporate that into the proposal. So again, the idea is that each person with collective intelligence is improving the quality of whatever you're deciding, that it's not positioning, but it's trying to get the best of the knowledge of the group. So those are a few tips.
Thank you
I just
very
want to
much.
pull out
Again,
further.
that's super,
Go ahead.
sorry, it's super helpful about the 100% and the abstaining and just being more explicit about it. John, I think you mentioned like talking about the dialogue process and decision-making process in very clear ways so people know about it. So that's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's just what I wanted to even uplift further in MJ's comment. The setting expectations, I think, can be such a powerful piece of that, and just knowing, you know, if you're going to use consent process or some of these others, you know, really communicating to people. You can make decisions really fast if you give people that sense of this is going to go forward unless somebody objects, and this is an objection that's valid to the group, you know, not just somebody's personal preference. We got a new brand color. Oh, I don't like yellow. But again, you make some decisions so that later you don't have to like do it over and over again with every decision. But I think too, just as an alternative too, depending on the group, I think the 100% and the abstain button is awesome. You can also do it in other ways of like just looking at who's read it too. And if you have that agreement, like if nobody objects, this is going to go through, and we are going to fully assume that you're consenting to this. Then you can look at, Loomio 2.0 has some really nice tools for seeing exactly who's seen what, especially if you sent them a notification. If you invite people to vote, you can look at exactly who's opened that up. And even if you remind them, you can look at who's been tagged in an mention and things like that. So that can help too.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point, John. We haven't mentioned facilitation, but, having someone in a facilitator role. So for instance, if you notice that someone that you think would really add a lot of value, at mentioning them and really welcoming them in, not as a sort of shaming, but more as a welcoming, inviting them into the group, at Natalie, it would be so awesome to get your perspective because I know you have deep experience in that area. So the facilitator role in Loomio is very important, very valuable, very rich for creating engagement, inclusion, better decision making, the same way it is in person.
Gone ahead and shared again the consent process guide there for you as well for that upcoming meeting.
Oh, great. Anything else popping up for today?
I'll definitely make contact around the Kaplan side of things, because we are also doing our coastal adaptation and the community-led sort of dynamic pathway method. So I'm not sure with our council what type of interactive discussion tool we're planning to use, but I'll definitely ask. But it was just thanks for it was really useful.
Great.
Glad to hear it. Anne, did you have a question?
Actually, these days, it's like the same effort to talk with somebody that's 1 kilometer away or someone that's at the other side of the ocean. And I discovered that actually this international calls and collaborations, that I like it a lot and that I would love to be more engaged in that. But, well, the question is, would that be helpful to do this remote work or healthy on a long term? Or is it just something that we have to survive through the pandemic and then meet each other again? Or would it be something that you can do for years, for instance, with people? What do you think?
Well, there are many organizations that have been working their whole companies are remote with hundreds, sometimes even thousands of workers, and have been doing that for years. So there are a number of organizations that are fully remote. And I'm part of the Loomio board and we're remote. And, I work with a consulting network and we're fully remote. So there are many organizations that have learned a way to really hum in that space. And, one of the benefits is you can bring in the right talent from across the globe that can really add value. It's really critical. Many of the things that we know about good organization, that you have good, clear framework and purpose and all of those things. Transparency is often much better in remote organizations because you need to put more in writing. And so, people then can check and test, that what's real and what's not. So if you look at a group called Corporate Rebels, they're a Dutch group that's traveled the world looking at self-managed organizations, and they have a number of examples of companies that have been working for several years that are fully remote. And yeah, it's a great website, Corporate Rebels. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Where are you based, Anne?
Belgium.
Belgium. Très bon. What else? Anything else?
Make a tiny comment on yours, and as well. It is interesting how much the culture matters, because I'll be talking with a friend of mine who's been with an all remote team for over a decade, a quite big tech company called GitLab. And then on the other hand, you have IBM, big company that was remote for many years, and then ended up deciding this isn't working for us. And I don't know the exact cultural context of what ended up making them decide that, but I guess what MJ talked about are some of the things I think we've seen in successful models.
You know what's a group you also might want to check out on is WeShare. What's the website, do you think, John? Is it .org? Probably.
I would just put it through a search engine. It's the unique name.
Yeah. So, and they're a network that does really interesting collaboration across the globe. It was instigated in France. All right, going. Last chance for a question.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all for joining us today. It was great to talk with you all.
It was great to be together. Thanks. Reach out if there are other questions. Great to be with you, John, and Tango together.
Mm-hmm.
And I will see you in cyberspace, everybody. Be well.
Thanks a lot.
I just kicked people out.
Let me get the stop recording.